I used to think that kale was an inferior form of cabbage, and although I still prefer cabbages for many uses, I really appreciate the reliability and continual cropping nature of the kale plants. We are getting better at incorporating kale into the meals that we eat, though I would like to find other ways to use this fairly tough brassica leaf in the kitchen. I'm also gradually getting better at growing this crop, which has become an essential part of the gardens, but this year I have perhaps been too successful. The plants have grown so well that I haven't been able to keep up with the harvest, and I've ended up composting quite a few of the leaves, but a certain amount of waste is probably okay with a crop like this. Kale is possibly one of the more appropriate crops to grow in our context. It is a hardy brassica plant that grows really well in the cool maritime climate that we have, producing well in the summer and autumn, and often continuing to grow through their relatively mild winters. Although a lot of people have been complaining about the poor weather this year, it has been quite good weather for growing this kind of crop. Though I think it did help to keep enough moisture in the soil with additional watering through the few dry spells that we did have. These kale plants can be productive over quite a long season if I manage them well, allowing me to plant once and harvest fresh leaves for many months. There are some potential pest and disease issues, which are common to all of the closely related brassica plants, but thankfully we don't have any issues with clubroot with our calcareous soil. Since I started covering all the large brassica plants with netting, the white cabbage butterfly haven't been able to lay their eggs, so I no longer see the damage I used to get from caterpillars. And the same netting prevents the wood pigeons from damaging any kale plants in the winter. I have been getting better at keeping the slug population low in and around the gardens, so there is rarely damage to the young kale plants, and I use trap crops to control the population of flea beetles, and the cabbage root maggots seem to prefer other brassica plants. There have been clusters of mealy cabbage aphids on the undersides of some of the kale leaves in the late summer and early autumn, but apart from this one pest, and some issues with nutrient deficiencies in the older leaves, the large kale plants have looked very strong and really healthy all summer and into the autumn this year. I've grown a trial of different kale varieties in the previous few years, and one hybrid variety seemed to produce more, and we also thought that it tasted better than the others. This year I wanted to simplify things a bit, or at least to have fewer things to keep track of, so I decided to plant this one hybrid variety of kale in 4 of the original gardens of this Red Gardens project. I also wanted to grow this kale as a main crop over a longer part of the growing season, rather than focusing on a late season or overwintering crop. So I sowed the seeds for all 4 gardens in mid-March, which is a little bit earlier than I would normally sow this crop. The seedlings were transplanted into the 4 gardens on the same day in early May, at closer spacings in the no-dig and intensive gardens, and slightly wider spacing in the extensive garden. In the polyculture garden, the kale plants were spread out across a large bed, mixed in with 5 other crops. The plants grew reasonably well, and I started harvesting from most of the plants in mid-June, and by July they were producing a huge amount of leaves. The biggest issue was that I wasn't able to harvest all the leaves when they were still in good condition. It seems that many people, including ourselves, prefer filling our dinner plates with the warm season fruiting crops while we still have them, and leave behind the more robust kale leaves, even though these plants were producing in abundance. But this is changing now that the weather has started to cool down, and the focus has shifted to more of an autumn harvest. Thankfully, the plants have continued to produce really well up until now, more than 6 months after sowing, and most of them are showing no signs of slowing down. All this is to explain how I ended up with way more kale than I could use or pass on to my neighbors over the past few months. Overall, the weather has been quite good for this type of crop. I sowed the seeds early enough so that the plants could take advantage of really good growing conditions. And there haven't been any significant pest or disease issues, apart from the recent clusters of cabbage aphids. I grew a really productive hybrid variety of kale, with between 9 and 12 large plants in each of the 4 separate gardens, for a total of 43 plants. And I've been fairly good at looking after this crop, including keeping the beds weed-free and continuing to provide enough fertility for most of these hungry plants. So the plants should have everything they need and don't suffer from competition, at least in 3 of the gardens. I haven't been so good at keeping the beds in the polyculture garden free of weeds, and with the dense interplanting of several different heavy-feeding plants, there are more signs of nutrient deficiencies in these kale plants. With so much being produced in the other gardens, I have avoided harvesting from the kale plants in this garden so far, and I'm interested to see how the plants will produce later in the season and over winter. I've been harvesting from 33 large kale plants from 3 gardens, and still probably discarded or composted almost half of the leaves that the plants produced. A lot of this is simply because there hasn't been enough demand for these larger, tougher leaves, and I left many of them on the plant long enough for nutrient deficiencies to start to appear on the leaves. This is because the plants are going through a natural process of extracting valuable nutrients, likely including nitrogen, from the older parts of the leaf farther down the plant for use in developing new leaves at the top of the plant. The parts of these older leaves that are still green are probably still edible, though possibly not as nutritious. But with so much to harvest, I composted anything that was slightly discolored. I was also away from the gardens for 3 weeks in September, and I had only asked a friend to keep up with the harvests of the summer fruiting crops. With the first harvest on my return to the gardens, quite a few of the older leaves had signs of nutrient deficiencies, and more leaves had clusters of mealy cabbage aphids. So I probably composted more than half of what I removed from the plants, but still ended up with an abundance to distribute to my friends and neighbors. I didn't weigh anything that was composted, but I did weigh all of the leaves that I separated out for eating. Looking at the data up until the beginning of September, the plants in the extensive garden, which were given a bit more space to grow, produced an average of about 2.3 kilograms per plant. The slightly more closely spaced kale plants in the intensive and the noted gardens produced about 1.8 kilograms per plant. But looking at the bed in total, the same amount of area in each garden produced just over 20 kilograms of good quality leaves over this period of time, or about 7 kilograms per square meter. That is already more kale harvested than any other crop of kale that have grown in the past, and we're only partway through the season, and that doesn't count anything that I composted. It also doesn't include what I'm currently harvesting, and it seems I could pick about 1 kilogram of lovely edible leaves from each plant, discarding about the same amount. And that still leaves a lot of growth at the top of the plants to keep producing into the autumn and hopefully for the winter. So I estimate that I will be able to harvest about 3 kilograms of good quality kale leaves from each plant up until the end of September, and the plants will continue to grow, producing leaves at a slower rate as the weather cools. The amount that I can harvest over the coming months probably depends a lot on how timely I pick the leaves, but the weather is also a factor, and if I can continue to make sure that these plants get all of the fertility that they need. So the total harvest from these kale plants will likely end up being at least 3 kilograms and probably closer to 4 kilograms from each plant, spread out over 7 or 8 months. And depending on how I manage the plants and how long I'm willing to keep them in the ground, they could produce a crop of broccoli-type sprouts in the spring, a full year after sowing. The overall yield will likely be more than 10 kilograms per square meter, possibly significantly more, which is a really impressive yield, especially for a leafy plant, and much bigger than any crop of kale that I've grown in the past. If I had managed to continue to harvest the leaves at appropriate times all summer and autumn, so that very few were degraded or ended up in the compost pile, the yield would have been significantly more. I've already mentioned some of the reasons why I think these plants have been so productive this year, including being able to provide enough fertility to these long season plants as they continue to grow. And I think that better fertility management is probably the most significant reason for why these plants have been able to produce so much this year. I had substantially amended the lower grade compost that I used at the beginning of the year in 2 of the gardens, and focused more on supplying adequate fertility to all of the plants on a regular basis through liquid feeding with nettle and comfrey teas and other forms of liquid fertility. And I believe that this has made a lot of difference this year with this heavy feeding kale crop, as well as with all the other large brassica plants. I think that fertility could still be improved, and I wonder how much longer the kale plants would maintain the older leaves if they had adequate fertility before they started cannibalizing or extracting and remobilizing the nutrients for the new growth. It is interesting to see that the kale plants in the different gardens are all growing equally well, apart from some of the more crowded and stressed plants in the polyculture garden. And it seems that these kale plants, and many of the other crops, can thrive in soil that has been either dug or managed with no-dig methods, fertilized with good quality compost, or with more reliance on the use of concentrates. There are differences between the gardens, but they are fairly minor, and I think this is because I've been able to provide adequate fertility to these long season plants, regardless of the method of soil preparation that I used. A lot of the kale that I grew has been wasted this year, but perhaps that is okay. Of course, I would rather have harvested all the leaves in their prime, working to balance higher yield and slightly more tender leaves, and had people eat everything that was produced. This would feel like a lot less food waste, but it would also provide better data on how much a crop like this could actually produce. But when growing our own food, we often have too much, and that's a good thing, or at least it is better than not having enough, because it is possible that these plants didn't produce nearly as well, and we ended up with not enough kale. After the experience this year, I could decide to grow a lot fewer kale plants next year for autumn and summer production, as there's just so much else to eat at that time of the year, and make space for other crops. But perhaps with crops like kale, it is good to have too many plants, as there is always an abundance of leaves to harvest whenever I need them, and the older leaves are composted and recycled into fertility for next year's crops. And these plants are also building up reserves of energy and nutrients in the large stem to continue to produce over the winter and into the early spring, when the fresh greens are much more valuable in our diets. I suspect that kale plants in the polyculture garden that have remained unharvested so far will have built up more reserves to be more productive in the late winter and early spring. But the plants in the other gardens, with their long bare stems and a cluster of leaves on top, could also continue to produce a substantial crop through to the spring, and it will be interesting to see how they compare. It seems to be a case of harvesting a lot of leaves now, or leaving them so that they might produce more leaves later, or perhaps a nice balance between the two.